Welcome to Chanakya, where you get the right guidance at the right time. We have an interesting challenge in the area of estimation in an agile environment, for which we will seek inputs from our experts JV and Vasu. Here is the challenge. Excel Infotech has been awarded a project for developing a warehousing application for a customer in the US. This is expected to be delivered as 3 incremental releases using an agile approach. Ravi is the Scrum Master for a cross-functional team of 8 team members. For the first release, the team used a relative sizing, and as part of this they identified a base story assigning it 5 points. They made an assumption for a velocity of 30 points at the beginning of the release, but found out by the end of release 1 that they could achieve only 25 points on average. The customer were upset that the team fell short by more than 15% of their commitments and wants them to make up in releases 2 and 3. As the team starts preparing for release 2 planning, they have a challenge. They have a completely new set of stories and a new scope. And add to the challenge, the team composition has changed, with 2 experienced team members leaving and replaced by 2 new lateral hires. When the planning starts, the team is confused about whether to use the same base story they used before, like as from release 1, or identify one from the set of stories for release 2. They are also confused about what velocity to assume, especially considering that they fell short in the first release and have 2 new members coming in. What would be your advice to Ravi and his team in this case? So let me start first with you, Vasu. What would be your advice? Let's take first the issue of base story assumption.
Okay. So if you look at the purpose of the base story, it is something that all team members can relate to and then use it as a reference to size other stories. I would prefer that they start with the story from the new backlog.
Okay.
The reason being that the scope of the work has changed and the stories are very different. Now, another point you have to consider is that there are 2 new team members who are not familiar with the old stories. So, I have had teams which try to bring up the new team members up to speed on the old story, but it's always been tough. So, I would prefer that they pick a story from the new backlog.
That would be your recommendation. Okay, good. So, JV, your views on this?
Yeah, I kind of, sometimes I've seen many teams do, what Vasu is recommending, and I've generally not tried to change what the team does. If they feel comfortable with it, that's fine. But my own take is, keep the same old base story from release 1. Fundamentally, the reason has got to do with the second part of what you said about velocity and things like that. Now, if I change the base story, I need to recalibrate the velocity, right? And the fundamental thing in this case is, how many team members have changed, whether the domain has changed, technology has changed dramatically, right? I agree there is new scope of work, but there is nothing that says the nature of work is very different, right? Yes, 2 team members have changed, but it's not that majority of the team has changed. So one way to look at it is just it's easier to educate the 2 new team members on the old story and get everybody up to speed on the same thing, and then use that so they can actually start calibrating with the same old velocity that they had. Now, of course, they can look at it differently. We'll come back to that when we look at velocity separately. But certainly on the base story wise, I think it's okay to continue with the same. It's what the team feels about.
It's interesting actually. Both are different perspectives, and they both sound very logical and good reasons, right? I can see both working really well in But whose decision is this, JV? I mean, should Ravi decide? Does the team have a role? Does the customer have a role?
I think it's the team, right? Ravi or the manager, the Scrum Master or the manager have a facilitative role to play in this whole game, right? It's ultimately the team that's going to actually live the velocity, live the assumptions and so on. So Ravi has a facilitative role. Now, customer, generally in a T&M situation, customer tends to interfere. But Ravi should educate the customer. He should be more interested in what's delivered, not so much the process or the mechanics that actually go into it.
Fair enough. So I guess essentially we have 2 sort of things. One is they could keep the same base story and go with it, or they could take a new base story. But either way, it's a team's decision.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Not so much customers or the Scrum Masters.
Ideally, that's what it should be.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, then let's take a look at the second confusion that the team was having, right? This is on the velocity. What velocity to assume now for the next release, right? So, Vasu, what's your take on velocity assumption?
Yeah, Ananth, as far as velocity is concerned, the team should pick a set of stories that seems doable in the first iteration or sprint.
Okay.
Then they should actually do a quick task breakdown and confirm whether that's doable or not. So this set of stories then drives the assumption on what the velocity could be. So this is the planned velocity, and as they do sprints, they'll be able to refine it based on what they accomplish. So that's my take on velocity.
Thanks, Vasu. JV, Vasu talked about recalibrating velocity for the new release, assuming a different base story, right? Whereas you had a perspective on keeping the same base story. So how does that work?
Yeah, see, I had mentioned same base story primarily because you don't need to recalibrate velocity by and large, right? That's one of the reasons why you do that. Now the team has an option to decide whether they are going to keep the same velocity or change the velocity. Now if the scope is complex, or since the two new team members have come in, they can actually decide that velocity may drop a little bit. Alternately, they can say, oh, we have worked together for a certain period of time. If you look at the last release, towards the end, we achieved a little more velocity than when we started, which should become more or less the baseline. The average is 25, but maybe towards the end, we achieved a little bit more. That should set the baseline for the upcoming release. So they have an option to decide. They have observed the velocity with a certain team, and they have used the same base story. And all the other sizing has been done based on that. So they have an option to decide what that velocity should be. Should be slightly higher, lower, same, based on the factors that have actually contributed to that. Right?
That's interesting, but there could be something that is bugging the team in their mind, right? Because the customer is upset, right? That, they delivered less than committed,
15% less.
Right? 15% less. So should that carry any weight?
As I said before, even in the base story thing, the customer will always want to involve himself, especially in a T&M situation. If it's a fixed price, very often customers are not too worried, right? In a T&M, they actually want to control the way the team works. But I believe that the SM, the Scrum Master in this case, Ravi, should educate the customer and say that we will take care of it. At the end of the day, we have delivered so much in release 1. Now, release 2 should be comparable in terms of what we delivered in release 1. That's what the customer should be concerned about, right? What the velocity is, what the base story is, this should be left to the team to decide how they want to work, right? Because otherwise I have to start educating him on how did I do the sizing and so on and so forth, right? So I think it's better that the customer is educated on this and he looks at what is delivered rather than how the team delivers it.
And the Scrum Master has a role to play in protecting the team here.
Absolutely. The Scrum Master has a major role to play in that, not getting pushed by the customer.
So great perspectives, JV and Vasu. Any other inputs or concluding thoughts?
I think there's one more. Now, when you look at velocity, a lot of times though, we look at only the planned velocity, actual velocity, the management practices, the way we work and so on and so forth. I think there are other practices that should be considered when you look at velocity. The team should look at those. For example, engineering practices like refactoring or test-driven development, or some of the practices like pair programming or mob programming, CI/CD. All of these have a major role to play in upping the productivity or velocity for the team. Right? The team needs to look at that and kind of factor that into the way they actually work.
So if they are trying to make some velocity assumptions, if they are planning these technical practices or engineering practices, or they've implemented it, they can hope to get a better velocity.
Absolutely. They should.
So their assumption can be a little bit higher.
They should be able to get a better velocity with some of these practices.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, JV. So let me just summarize quickly. I've got here 3 points I've noted. On both the base story and velocity assumptions, one key thing is the comfort of the team is the key, right? Either way it would work, comfort of the team is the key. And the second thing is consider technical and other engineering practices to improve velocity, right? And that can help you make maybe a slightly higher number for velocity assumptions. And finally, ensure as a Scrum Master, you protect the team from the influence of the customer, right? And on the day-to-day working. Is that a fair summary here?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks Vasu, thanks JV. I'm sure Agile Scrum Masters and PMs like Ravi would find these perspectives very useful. Thank you for joining us.